Well, good morning. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today on what looks like an absolutely terrific agenda ahead. Now, the focus of my contribution today will be on the UK 2070 Commission, which is a commission into spatial inequalities. So big picture, if you like, but I think there's a very strong connection with the other discussions you're going to have later on. And my personal view is that the two defining issues that we face in this age are tackling climate change and responding to inequalities. Now, the Commission published its first report in Leeds in June of this year. We're an independent commission, not part of government or indeed any other organisation, and we are consciously long game. So we're looking at spatial inequalities going back 50 years and going forward 50 years, hence the title 2070. We have, of course, made recommendations for the here and now, but we believe fundamentally that if you want to make a difference, you have to look over much longer periods than most British policy actually does. Now, the conclusions of our first report make sobering reading. Firstly, on a comparison of the UK with 30 other OECD countries across a broad range of 28 indicators, the UK comes 28th out of 30 in terms of interregional inequalities. That's sort of Eurovision Song Contest levels of underperformance. Secondly, despite the efforts of successive governments to tackle this gap, and indeed the undoubted successes of individual places, the gap has grown wider. It hasn't narrowed, it's grown wider. And thirdly, the key point here is that there has been an effective decoupling of London and the South East from the rest of the economy. In other words, the benefits of growth have not trickled down. And thirdly, what we've found is that unless decisive action is taken, that gap will continue to grow. So that London and the South East, on our modelling, in a higher growth scenario, will take over half of the jobs and yet be not much over a third of the population. Now, you might say this is good news for London and the South East. But actually it isn't, because we see three consequences from this current and growing imbalance. Firstly, we're obviously not taking advantage of the economic opportunities in the rest of the country. Secondly, that imbalance of wealth and opportunity is creating division, and I think we could see that very much in the Brexit and referendum debate. But thirdly, it creates enormous pressure on London and the South East. And what we've done is some modelling of the consequences of growing imbalance, and you see higher real house prices in London and longer commute times. In other words, everybody loses. Nobody wins from this growing imbalance. Now, in our report, we look at the actions of successive governments and find them to have been too fragmented, too short-term, and indeed significantly outweighed by the fact that investment has typically gone more to London and the South East than the rest of the country. In other words, we've had a regional policy in this country. It's just worked in the opposite direction to that which was intended. But we aren't a council of despair. We looked at other international examples and found that in the case of West and East Germany, they had managed to make progress through a big and concerted programme of rebalancing. Have they cracked all the problems between those two parts of the country? Absolutely not. Big issues still to deal with. But it's striking to note that the UK is now more interregionally unequal than Germany was in 1995 in the aftermath of reunification. So in other words, Germany has been two countries and they are concertedly trying to make it one. We have been one country and are moving towards being many. Now, it's not impossible to deliver a rebalancing in the UK, but it will require a radical change in direction. And that change of direction was set out in our second report, which we published before the party conferences. We called it Moving Up the Gears, and we identified 7 priorities for action. Firstly, embedding spatial justice into tackling climate change. We need, in effect, to turn the double-headed crisis, as many have called it, in other words, the link between climate change and inequality, those places that get least of the economic benefits suffer most of the climate change consequences. We have to deal with that double-headed challenge and have a just transition to zero carbon. And in particular, we need to ensure that spatial justice, rebalancing, is embedded in the UK's contribution. So, for example, we need to ensure we've got more balanced economic growth so that we harness brownfield land and don't ever increase the journey times for commuters. We also need to use the investment we'll need to make to achieve climate change in new green industries, consciously to put those in places where more economic growth is needed. So in other words, we need to turn the double-headed crisis into a double-headed opportunity in the UK. Our second priority was delivering a connectivity revolution. The transport and digital networks in the UK are not fit for purpose, inadequate capacity, incomplete, unsustainable. And in fact, they reinforce the patterns of inequality in the UK. So we argue for a revolution in connectivity that creates a new integrated UK network between cities, within cities, and beyond cities. We see that form of network approach, rather than the scheme approach that we've had for years, is the way forward. Our third priority is to harness the research and knowledge-intensive industries in this country. We are potentially a global leader, but we're too concentrated in the so-called golden triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge. We need to create at least one complementary northern centre of excellence that would reinforce our role. Some have called it an MIT of the North. We need to have more centres of excellence. But the corollary of that, and our fourth priority, is that we also need to strengthen the foundations of local economies. And that's very much the theme of the work that's been done for the New Economics Foundation that I'm delighted now to be chair of. The way I would put it is that we need to be about Grimsby as well as graphene. We have to work on both. 40% of the economy is what's called foundational or everyday. And in deprived communities, it's even higher. Now, this never sets the pulses racing of ministers, but it is critical to tackling inequality, especially in terms of education and health outcomes. And we can learn a lot from the initiatives in Wales that are undertaken at the moment. So fifth, a step change in devolution. We need to move away from rhetoric to real action on devolution. We need to move away from a deal-based approach to a clear plan that devolves powers and funding to the lowest practical level. Different places will move at different speeds, but the direction of travel has to be clear. And what we can't devolve locally, we'll need to look at dealing with through new regional collaborations, North, Midlands, Southwest and Southeast. Sixthly, we need to shape the future through national spatial plans. It is extraordinary that we have spatial plans for Scotland, for Wales, for Northern Ireland, indeed much of Northern Europe, but we have no economic spatial plan for England. And if we were to develop such a plan, it would be an enabler for regional and local plans and would guide investment and shape development. Seventh and finally, we need to significantly increase the investment in infrastructure and level the playing field to access that funding. We don't want a zero-sum game. London clearly needs investment. And indeed, there is evidence that London itself is decoupling between the more affluent parts of London and the less affluent people in London. So this is not a zero-sum game. The rest of the country benefits and London gets nothing. We as a country spend 1.2% of our GDP on infrastructure. We should be nearer 3%, and that will allow us to focus the new money out of London and the South East. And that will require a reappraisal of the way the Green Book, the so-called Green Book, works on evaluating value for money schemes. So those are the 7 priorities. I've gone through them all very quickly because the most important point I would make here is that we need a comprehensive, long-term and sustained approach to these issues. What we can't do is deal with this through a piecemeal, pea-shooter policies, start-stop policies that look at an issue and then move on. For example, we need to do towns and cities and not get into a debate about towns v cities. We haven't done the job yet in cities, but we also have a massive challenge in our very left-behind places that we're going to hear about in a minute. There's more to do. We want to look at housing. We want to look at skills in more depth. But let me just conclude with this point. I think we can and should seize this critical political moment. The response to our reports was incredibly strong. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, said it was the report he had been waiting for all his political life. I thought that was some recommendation. The regional papers in the north ran a common story about the importance of rebalancing. So I think the moment is now to press this agenda, and we can and should do that. And I think there is an unstoppable desire for change. And of course, as I said earlier, we have to work at this big picture level, rebalancing the whole of the UK, and also at individual local level to rebalance local economies as well. It's not either or, it's both. I think we do have the analysis here of what the challenge is and how we might deal with it. We need now to make that evidence count in terms of action. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Kerslake. MIT of the North, Manchester Institute of Technology, Macclesfield Institute of Technology. I'd now like to invite Dr. Carolyn Wilkins, OBE, Chief Executive of Oldham Council, to speak.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not using slides, but there's a clicker transfer underway. So, morning everybody. Sorry, slightly odd with you over there. I hope you can hear me. As introduced, Carolyn Wilkins, I'm Chief Executive of Oldham Council, and I'm also actually Accountable Officer of Oldham CCG. So I'm one of a small number of chief execs who hold both an NHS role and a local government role, and I'll touch on more of that later. So I'm sure everybody in the room is intimately familiar with Oldham, knows where it is, knows everything about it. Just in case you're not, we are a borough in the north, often described as the post-industrial north. So we are a borough with a population of about 234,000 and a non-white, black and minority ethnic population of about 22.5%, so almost a quarter of our population, primarily Bangladeshi and Pakistani heritage, but that is changing, and are often described, along with many of these other post-industrial northern towns, northern boroughs, with high levels of deprivation, poor quality housing, lack of investment, weaker levels of economic growth, often linked any growth to increasingly vulnerable sectors, for example, the public sector and the service sector. So very much what Sir Bob has just described in terms of that kind of context. In fact, a recent University of Manchester report stated, the town occupies, therefore, a certain iconic position within contemporary political and media discourses of race, class, politics and nation. And I don't think they mean that in a complimentary way in terms of iconic position. But like most boroughs, we're a borough of contrast. So Saddleworth, which may be known to you, not least if you go over the M62 on a regular basis, 23% of Oldham Borough is within the Peak District National Park. And then Failsworth, which is on the kind of the western side, is less than 5 miles from Manchester city centre. So, but across that distance, there's about a 12-year life expectancy gap. And there's a much more significant quality of life gap across that. So some of the challenges we face are exactly as have already been described. We're one of the 10 Greater Manchester authorities, so Andy Burnham is the mayor for Oldham as well, in terms of the Greater Manchester mayor. And we really value that. We recognise the value as set out in the Manchester Independent Economic Review over a decade ago, really. Greater Manchester as a functioning economic entity, that's important to us, and we play an active role in it. However, and increasingly I think we're all alive to the however, we recognise the challenges that have impacted on a borough from a very city-centric view of growth and economic strategy and investment. For example, if you have a transport strategy which is predicated really on getting people in and out to high productivity jobs in the city centre, you don't have a transport strategy that helps people move around the city region to those less productive jobs and roles, but that a significant percentage of our workforce access. And all kinds of assumptions get built in, like, well, if we put the warehousing jobs in Wigan, that will, that'll be great for the people of Oldham. Wigan's a long way from Oldham, and if you've got to get to work by 5 different bus routes, and if you miss one, and you've got childcare issues as well. So increasingly, I think what we're all recognising is that economic strategy has to be intimately connected with the reality of people's lives. It has to be about people and places and communities. So Greater Manchester has had an independent prosperity review. I know some people in the room have contributed towards that, looking at how all communities contribute to and benefit from growth. And from that, our local industrial strategy as part of our wider strategic framework, looking at productive inclusive economy and the challenges, particularly around things like skills, infrastructure, but also the health of our population. Health inequality is a really, really big barrier to productivity, but also the importance of social infrastructure, which very often doesn't get talked about, but actually we are also not just an economic entity as a city region, we're a social entity as well. People have family networks, they shop, they have leisure pursuits, and actually that social infrastructure is a really significant, important part of our approach and agenda within Greater Manchester, but particularly within Oldham. So for us, it's very much at a local level. How do we make sense of the plethora of different strategies, different frameworks? How do we have the kind of the opposite of the Humpty Dumpty effect, really? How do we put all the pieces back together again to make sense for our places, our communities, our organisations? So we very much have a kind of adopt and adapt approach, recognising that whilst it's really important to have that collective voice upwards, not least on some of the structural issues that need to be addressed, like how funding regimes for housing and infrastructure are skewed by performance metrics that link to high cost, high value, return on investment. We want to translate that into something that's really meaningful locally. And you've got a session I noticed on the agenda later today about language, and does it matter? Yes, it matters a lot. Language can really diminish and distance things like holiday hunger, poverty premium, period poverty, 2-word alliterations that actually really diminish and sort of suggest kind of benign things that are anything but benign, are absolutely traumatic for people to experience. Language actually can also reduce complexity to stereotypes, which, and we all know this with stereotypes, they're not necessarily untrue, but they are definitely not the whole story. And the way that language is used to frame issues and places is also really important in shaping the response. I have to say, Sir Bob used one of my particular favourites, places left behind, as a phrase. We didn't miss the bus in Oldham. We weren't sitting there somehow thinking, this is not for us. Actually, it can kind of negate the structural inequality that makes it very hard for some places to not get left behind, to take active place. So I think it can also limit the response because it can locate the responsibility not where it actually should be or not where it should entirely be. So language matters, and it's mattered to us in Oldham when we've been looking to frame our shared endeavour. So for us, our ambitions are about thriving communities, not just resilient communities. We want to be resilient, but we want to thrive, actually. Our communities deserve that. We want an inclusive economy because there isn't always growth. So actually, how do we have an economy that works, whether in times of growth or not, but people can contribute and benefit from it? And how is that supported by cooperative working? So by that, it's not just about public services. We can be a bit kind of egocentric, really. and services that have a population approach at their heart. So we work very much about insight and understanding. For example, how do our policies label and define people? So, for example, if you're in temporary accommodation, you may have had a bus pass for your kids when you were 3 miles away from the school. Your temporary accommodation is now nearer than 3 miles. You lose your free bus pass because our policy framework doesn't see you. It just sees the distance. So how do we take that kind of insight and knowledge and flex and work with the policy framework? And there was a review in last week's Financial Times about a more centred, a book review about a more centred view of economics, one that looks at what people actually value and how do we value things like the dignity and community impact of work. And so in Oldham, we're very much looking at how do we brigade all of our resources. And we don't look at the traditional kind of approaches to things like economy of scale. You know, if we stick together, we can do things cheaper. We look at how do we use the totality of our resources to achieve economy of outcome. So, for example, in 2013, only 40% of children in Oldham achieved a good level of development. By connecting all of our resources and working around that, we're now at 68.1. Point 1 is very important, which is 2% away from the national average. Over 80% of our schools are good or outstanding. These outcomes are really hard won, but actually if we don't get that kind of foundation right, the strategies will never be able to be accessed by some other communities. So that whole system view, thinking really differently, how we see people, is really important. So the Anchor Mission agenda, partly the reason why I took the NHS role, was so that you could influence things like how the NHS sees place, how it recognised lived experience, how we use all our resources, whether it's allowing the community power cooperative to put solar panels on our buildings, whether it's fruit roots and community orchards and growing hubs in all of our parks, whether it's who do we employ and where do they live. We've done that detailed analysis across major public sector employers. And Werneth, a ward in Oldham, which is in the top 10 deprived in the country, 66% of children live in poverty. As a council, we only employ 57 people from that ward. If we employed 200, we would change the economic outcome of that ward really quickly. So looking in really granular detail about where we spend, how we see people, how we really harness the power of diversity, not just have diversity, how we recognise those kind of barriers. So I was talking to somebody who self-identifies as being high-functioning autistic, and he was saying, I just don't understand any of the rules of the game. I can't get a job, even though I've got 2 doctorates. Because when you ask me in an interview, what are my strengths? I talk about making and playing guitars, and then you tell me that's not really what you're after. It's how are my strengths relevant to the job, not the question you asked me. So actually, the barriers can be in the really small details. So for all of us, it's not enough just to have insight and understanding. It's so important that we translate that into our broader approaches, our broader strategies, so that we feed up, so that we see real change that recognises us, that speaks to us, and that doesn't exclude us. So I just want to end with a quote from Jen Williams, who did a series of articles recently about Oldham in the Manchester Evening News. And she said, there is much to admire in Oldham of 2019, and if you look for it, a great deal of hope. While admitting that times feel tough, people stress their tale is also one of pride and generosity, of hope, resilience, imagination, and solutions. Thank you.